There are moments when change does not arrive like thunder, but like a quiet shift in the air, a subtle rearrangement inside you that no one else can see yet. You may have felt it recently in the pauses between your thoughts, in the strange sense that the life you have been living no longer fits the person you are becoming. What if this inner discomfort is not confusion at all? What if it is the earliest sign that your connection with the universe is no longer theoretical, no longer something you read about or hope for, but something beginning to move through you in a real and irreversible way? For many people, this phase feels unsettling before it feels sacred. The old emotional patterns still speak in a familiar voice, asking you to stay where everything is predictable, while something deeper in your consciousness starts pulling you toward a reality that cannot be built from the same fears, the same reactions, or the same identity. Joe Dispenza often speaks about how the body becomes conditioned to the past, repeating emotions until they feel like personality. And that is why this season can feel so strange. You are not only changing your thoughts, you are loosening the grip of an old internal program that once taught your nervous system how to survive, but never taught your soul how to expand. This is why nothing in your life will remain the same from this point forward. Not because the universe is suddenly choosing you for spectacle, but because your perception is beginning to reorganize itself. And when perception changes at the deepest level, reality does not stay untouched for long. What unsettles most people at the beginning of an inner shift is not the change itself, but the strange feeling of no longer being able to return to the version of themselves that once felt familiar. There is a quiet grief in that moment. You begin to notice that the routines, conversations, ambitions, and even distractions that used to hold your attention now feel thinner than before, as if they belong to someone you are slowly outgrowing. Many interpret this as emotional fatigue, lack of motivation, or a passing spiritual confusion, but something more delicate is often happening beneath the surface. A deeper part of the self is becoming sensitive to what no longer carries truth, and that sensitivity can feel uncomfortable before it feels liberating. This is why the beginning of a real connection with the universe rarely feels like instant peace. More often, it feels like friction. The mind still reaches for certainty, but the old certainties no longer nourish you. The body still follows familiar emotional patterns, but they begin to feel heavy in a way they did not before. Joe Dispenza has often described how the body becomes conditioned to the emotions of the past, repeating them so often that they become a biological identity. In practical terms, this means a person can deeply long for renewal while still being chemically attached to stress, anticipation, disappointment, or control. The heart asks for expansion, but the nervous system keeps bracing for impact. That inner contradiction creates one of the most painful states a person can experience, wanting a different life while feeling internally wired for the same one. For this reason, the earliest sign of transformation is not always joy. Sometimes it is the sudden inability to keep pretending that what drains you is still acceptable. Sometimes it is the way your body reacts after being in certain environments, the exhaustion that follows meaningless conversations, or the quiet ache that appears when you realize how long you have abandoned your own inner rhythm just to remain emotionally manageable to others. This is not weakness, it is refinement. It is the beginning of an internal honesty that can no longer be silenced without consequence. Carl Jung wrote in many forms about the parts of the self that remain hidden until life creates enough pressure for them to emerge. What rises from within at first may seem confusing, even disruptive, because the psyche does not always reveal itself in polished language. It reveals itself in restlessness, in recurring symbols, in changes of desire, in moments when the old emotional costume no longer fits the soul wearing it. This is why inner change often feels like disorientation before it feels like clarity. The old map is dissolving, but the new one has not fully appeared. There is also a quieter dimension to this process that many people overlook. Not every feeling of emptiness is a sign that something is missing. Sometimes emptiness appears because something false is leaving. A room sounds different when unnecessary furniture is removed. The echo is not a problem. It is evidence of space. In the same way, when your inner world begins to detach from old noise, old roles, and old emotional addictions, there may be a temporary stillness that feels almost too open. Yet this openness is often the first real room the universe has had within you. So if your life has begun to feel unfamiliar, if your reactions are changing, if your tolerance for surface living is dissolving, do not rush to label this season as a breakdown. There are seasons when your inner world stops asking for comfort and starts asking for truth. And when that happens, what is changing inside you is not random at all. It is the beginning of a deeper alignment, one that does not announce itself with spectacle, but with a slow and undeniable shift in what your soul can no longer ignore. One of the most overlooked reasons people feel disconnected from the universe is not a lack of desire, sincerity, or spiritual interest, but the invisible force of emotional conditioning. A person may speak the language of renewal, long for peace, and deeply crave a more aligned life, while still carrying an internal chemistry shaped by years of stress, disappointment, hypervigilance, and silent self-protection. This is where so much confusion begins. The conscious mind reaches toward a new reality, but the body continues rehearsing an old one. Joe Dispenza has often returned to this idea in his work, explaining that when the body memorizes emotional states for long enough, it begins to live as if the past is still happening. That means a person can genuinely want connection, while unconsciously remaining loyal to inner states that were built in seasons of fear. This is why spiritual stagnation does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like checking the phone every few minutes, feeling restless in silence, searching for constant stimulation, or moving from one small distraction to the next without ever feeling restored. In modern life, many people are not exhausted only because they are busy. They are exhausted because their attention has been fragmented into pieces too small to hold depth. The brain adapts to quick rewards, tiny bursts of novelty, and repeated anticipatory loops, and over time this creates a subtle dependence on emotional noise. The result is not just distraction, it is a weakening of inner receptivity. When the nervous system becomes attached to stimulation, stillness starts to feel unfamiliar, and what is unfamiliar is often interpreted as emptiness. This is where a deeper misunderstanding of manifestation and spiritual connection quietly takes root. Many people assume that connection with the universe should always feel heightened, intense, vivid, or emotionally charged. They expect signs that are obvious, sensations that are immediate, and reassurance that arrives in unmistakable forms. Yet genuine alignment often emerges in the opposite direction. It comes not through emotional excess, but through a quieter coherence. It is less like fireworks and more like a lake becoming clear after the wind has settled. The sky was always there above it, but the surface could not reflect it while it was constantly disturbed. That is why silence holds such unusual power. Silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is the absence of interruption. It is the moment when the psyche can hear what constant input had been covering. For some, silence initially feels unbearable because it removes the small habits that help them avoid themselves. The mind begins to notice what the noise had concealed: unresolved grief, unnamed fear, fatigue disguised as strength, longing disguised as irritation. Yet this discomfort is not evidence that something is wrong. It is often the first honest contact with what has been waiting beneath the surface all along. Bruce Lipton's work on belief and biological response points towards something equally important here. Repeated inner states do not remain abstract. They influence the body, the perception of reality, and the expectations a person brings into each new day. When someone has lived too long in disappointment, even possibility can feel suspicious. When someone has lived too long in urgency, peace can feel unproductive. This is why connection with the universe is not simply about thinking better thoughts. It is about becoming available to a different internal rhythm, one that does not require chaos in order to feel alive. The shift begins in subtle ways. A person starts noticing that not every impulse deserves obedience, not every thought deserves belief, not every desire for stimulation is true hunger. There comes a moment when the need to fill every silence begins to loosen, and in that opening something more intelligent can be felt. Not louder, not theatrical, but truer. The universe rarely forces itself into a crowded interior life. It becomes more perceptible when the noise loses its authority. And that is often the hidden threshold. Not the moment life becomes extraordinary, but the moment your inner world becomes quiet enough to recognize what has been trying to reach you all along. There is a particular kind of anxiety that does not come from what is happening around you, but from what is beginning to dissolve within you. It is the unease of no longer being able to force life into the shape your old identity depended on. At first, this can feel deeply unsettling because the mind interprets the loss of control as danger, even when the soul recognizes it as movement. That is why so many people enter a season of inner transformation and misread it as failure. They think they are becoming lost, when in truth they are becoming less willing to live by patterns that were built only to protect them. Beneath that tension, a different intelligence is trying to form, one that is not driven by panic, urgency, or the need to predict every outcome. That movement between control and surrender is one of the clearest thresholds in a genuine quantum connection with the universe, a threshold reflected in the writing principles of emotional depth, symbolic language, and the tension between silent anxiety and authentic reconnection found in your TXT base. Much of human behavior is organized around the illusion that safety comes from control. The more uncertain life feels, the more the mind wants immediate confirmation, fixed answers, visible progress, and emotional guarantees. Yet this inner gripping has a cost. It narrows perception. It makes every delay feel personal, every silence feel threatening, and every unknown moment feel like proof that something is wrong. The person may believe they are trying to stay responsible, but inwardly, they are often trapped in a contract with fear. Joe Dispenza's work helps illuminate why this happens so powerfully. When the body has lived in repeated emotional states for years, it begins to anticipate the future through the chemistry of the past. Control then becomes less a choice and more a reflex. It is not always loud. Sometimes it appears as overthinking, rehearsing conversations that have not happened, needing signs before taking a breath, or silently scanning life for evidence that things are finally moving. And yet the universe does not often meet us most clearly in that contracted state. A clenched hand cannot receive with the same ease as an open one. This does not mean openness is simple. For many people, the moment they stop trying to mentally manage every outcome, they come face to face with the raw material beneath the control itself. Old fear, buried grief, a private terror of disappointment, the worry that if they do not hold everything together, everything will collapse. This is why release can feel more frightening than effort. Effort at least gives the ego a role. Release asks the ego to witness something larger than its own strategies. There is a quiet lesson in nature that speaks directly to this. Winter does not argue with spring. The seed does not demand visible proof every morning that growth is happening underground. The river does not become weak because it bends around stone. In the same way, inner alignment is not built through constant internal pressure. It is built through a steadier relationship with time, one in which transformation is allowed to ripen rather than be forced into performance. This is what patience means at a deeper level. Not passivity, not resignation, but the ability to remain internally coherent while reality rearranges itself beyond the speed of the ego's preferences. This is also where anxiety begins to change its meaning. It is no longer seen only as an enemy to suppress, but as energy waiting for a wiser direction. Underneath many anxious states, there is often one simple pain, the fear that life is moving without your permission. But the deeper truth is that some of the most necessary changes in consciousness begin precisely where permission is no longer asked from the part of you that only knows how to survive. Something greater begins to lead, not louder, not harsher, but truer. And when this shift begins, control starts losing its throne. In its place comes a quieter strength, the kind that no longer needs immediate proof in order to remain present. That is when the connection deepens, not when everything becomes easy, but when your inner world stops demanding certainty as the price for trust. The clearest sign that something real is changing within you is not always dramatic. It is often revealed in the quiet ways your relationship with life begins to shift. What once pulled you into emotional reaction now feels easier to see before it takes over. What once seemed urgent begins to lose some of its power. Places, habits, and even certain conversations start revealing their weight more clearly, as if your inner world has become more honest about what nourishes it and what quietly drains it. This is one of the least celebrated but most important dimensions of spiritual change. Before the outer world rearranges itself in visible ways, perception itself begins to refine, and when perception refines, discernment becomes sharper than desire. You no longer want everything you once chased. You start wanting what is true. This is where emotional coherence becomes more than an abstract idea. It becomes the silent architecture of a new life. Many people imagine coherence as permanent calm, as if an aligned person no longer feels conflict, grief, irritation, or uncertainty. But real coherence is more mature than that. It is not the absence of emotional movement. It is the growing ability to remain inwardly connected, even when those movements arise. It is the difference between being carried away by every internal storm and becoming able to stand inside yourself while the weather changes. Bruce Lipton's work, in its own way, points to how repeated inner environments shape lived experience. When fear, resentment, or helplessness dominate the inner atmosphere for too long, they become conditions through which reality is interpreted. But when a person begins to cultivate a steadier emotional field, something subtle happens. Life may not become instantly easier, yet it becomes less distorted. This is why the process often feels quieter than people expect. The first fruit of reconnection is not always immediate abundance or visible miracles. Sometimes it is the ability to notice a familiar emotional pattern before obeying it. Sometimes it is the growing discomfort with self-abandonment. Sometimes it is the realization that peace is not found in dramatic breakthroughs, but in the repeated decision to stop feeding what fractures you inside. In a world that rewards performance, this kind of transformation can seem unimpressive from the outside, yet inwardly it is profound. It is the moment an old identity begins losing authority over your nervous system, your imagination, and your daily choices. There is also a kind of humility in this stage that many people do not immediately recognize. The more connected someone becomes, the less they need to prove that connection through intensity. A finely tuned instrument does not need to be played loudly to reveal that it is in tune. In the same way, a person whose inner frequency is changing often becomes less impulsive, less fascinated by extremes, less hungry for outer validation that the process is working. Something steadier takes root. The need to force outcomes softens. The need to explain every inner shift weakens. A quieter confidence begins to form, not because all uncertainty has disappeared, but because the self is no longer as divided against itself. This also changes how daily life is experienced. The ordinary begins to reveal more meaning, a pause before reacting, a deeper breath in the middle of tension, a sudden awareness that an old environment no longer matches your inner rhythm. Small moments that once passed unnoticed begin carrying significance. This is how a new reality often begins, not through spectacle, but through repeated moments in which you stop betraying what your deeper consciousness has already recognized. The universe does not always speak through grand events. Sometimes it speaks through the growing inability to live in ways that once felt normal. And that is why nothing remains the same after this point. Not because every external detail changes overnight, but because your inner way of meeting life is being rewritten. The old self survived through reaction, control, and emotional repetition. The emerging self begins to move through presence, discernment, and coherence. That difference may seem invisible at first, but it eventually touches everything. Relationships, decisions, energy, time, meaning. Once the inner instrument begins to hold a truer note, life itself begins to reorganize around what can finally resonate with it. What has been awakening inside you was never meant to leave your life untouched. The deeper truth is that a real connection with the universe does not begin when the world around you suddenly becomes perfect, but when something within you becomes too honest to keep living the same way. The old emotional patterns may still echo from time to time, the familiar fears may still try to pull your attention backward, and uncertainty may still appear in moments when the path ahead is not fully visible. But something essential has already shifted. You have begun to notice what once controlled you without being seen. You have begun to feel the difference between noise and truth, between reaction and presence, between chasing signs and becoming the sign that your inner world is changing. Joe Dispenza often points toward the power of becoming greater than the body's memorized past, and that is exactly where this transformation becomes sacred. The universe meets you differently when you are no longer repeating yourself in the same unconscious ways. It begins to reflect a new level of coherence, a new emotional atmosphere, a new relationship with your own consciousness. That is why this moment matters. You are not simply learning something inspiring. You are standing at the edge of a new identity, and once the soul has recognized a deeper frequency, it cannot fully return to the life it lived before. From this point on, everything begins to rearrange around who you are becoming. Before this video ends, there is one question that may stay with you long after these words are gone. If the universe has already begun changing something inside you, what part of your old life can no longer come with you? That question is not small because the answer may reveal exactly where your transformation has already started. If this message spoke to something real within you, subscribe to the channel and stay connected to this journey. There is much more here for the part of you that knows this awakening is not random. And do not stop here. Continue with the video appearing on your end screen, because the next message may help you understand even more clearly what the universe is trying to activate in your life right now. Sometimes one video opens the door, but the next one helps you recognize that the door was always meant for you,